Eastern Front was the first front of World War II. On the night of September 1st, 1939, the German army invaded Poland. About 2 years will pass, and the Eastern Front will become decisive in this war, the most brutal and bloody in human history. It is here on the Eastern Front that Hitler's conquest will come to an end. Victory over German fascism will be achieved primarily at the cost of the heroism and colossal sacrifices of the Soviet people and their army. This victory not only freed the world from Nazi domination, it also contributed to the strengthening of a powerful totalitarian system embodied by Joseph Stalin. Russia, the Forgotten Years, the Eastern Front, Part 1. Hitler had been preparing Germany for war against the Soviet Union since he came to power. His goal was to end Bolshevism in Russia, and at the same time to conquer new living space for the Third Reich. Stalin was also preparing for war. However, he understood that Hitler was a very strong opponent. Stalin wanted to gain space and time. The two dictators hated, feared, and tried to outsmart each other. Each considered the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, signed by Molotov and Ribbentrop on August 23, 1939, a personal achievement. Now, without fearing a strike from the Eastern Giant, Hitler could boldly attack Poland and then other European states. The Soviet Union received its share of territory, the eastern part of Poland, the Baltics, and Bessarabia. And part of Finland, for which, however, the Red Army had to pay with heavy losses. Stalin expected that a clash with Germany would not occur before 1942. However, Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union much earlier. In December 1940, he approved a plan for a large-scale invasion of Russia, the Barbarossa Plan. According to it, the Wehrmacht troops were to reach the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line in no more than 4 months. About 3.5 million soldiers were to participate in the operation. Military directives prescribed waging war with unheard-of brutality. They stated that several tens of millions of people in this territory would become superfluous and die, or be forced to relocate to Siberia. The Soviet people could not help but feel the looming threat of war. However, official propaganda assured them that there would be no attack. Doubting this, especially openly, was dangerous. Moreover, most people had boundless faith in Stalin. They also believed in the strength of the Red Army, which consumed the lion's share of the people's resources and was considered invincible. No one could imagine that the enormous Soviet military machine would be unable to defend the country. Soviet people were not afraid of war, but they did not want it. They did not know the truth about the danger of war. Meanwhile, as early as the beginning of 1941, Stalin received information about Germany's intensified preparations for an attack on the USSR. These came personally from US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Tense music. This information was confirmed by numerous reports from state security agents and German anti-fascists such as Haro Schulze-Boysen. The information reached the head of the NKVD, 𝑻𝒉𝒆 and all party and army leaders. Tense music. In March 1941, the Barbarossa Plan was on the desk of Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of the General Staff Georgy Zhukov. In late spring, Soviet spy Richard Sorge, Ramsey, provided the exact dates for the start of the war. But Stalin stubbornly continued to consider all the information provocative. He categorically forbade bringing the troops to full combat readiness. Literally on the eve of the war, leaves for officers were allowed in many units. Until the last peaceful day, Soviet trains with fuel and ore, which would sustain the German war industry for a long time, were sent to Germany. The German offensive began at dawn on June 22, 1941, along the entire line of the Soviet state border from the Arctic to the Black Sea, spanning over 2,000 kilometers. For the Red Army, unprepared for this blow, it was devastating. Most border battles, which usually last from several days to several months, ended in 3-4 hours. Alarming music ad. Noon on June 22nd, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov informed the Soviet people about the war that had begun. By this time, the Germans had advanced tens of kilometers into Soviet territory in some areas. Only in a few places did poorly armed border guards fight in complete encirclement for more than a day. They hoped for quick reinforcements. With persistence that surprised the Germans, the garrison of the Brest fortress, caught off guard, held out. The Germans completely destroyed the fortress and killed almost all its defenders. But it took them a whole month to do so. Hitler brought Mussolini here specifically to boast about the enemy they had managed to overcome. By this time, Brest was deep in the German rear. In the first hours of the war, the Germans destroyed the entire Soviet frontline aviation, which hadn't even managed to take off from the airfields. German planes bombed border military and civilian targets almost unimpeded. Only the Soviet Navy managed to repel all attacks by Hitler's aviation, as Commander-in-Chief 𝑀𝒉𝒆 Nikolai Kuznetsov did not wait for orders, and prepared the sailors for a possible attack in advance. The ground forces, having no defensive lines, retreated hastily almost everywhere. They left behind a huge number of dead and wounded, and a lot of military equipment, often undamaged. Out of the entire first echelon, that is, out of 56 rifle divisions, only 3 truly fought. The 41st Division of General 𝑉𝒂 Mikhachev in 𝑹𝒖𝒔𝒔𝒊𝒂, the 99th Division of Colonel Alexander Dementiev in 𝑃remysl, and the 67th Division of General Nikolai Dadayev in Lipov. The command of the Red Army had no real understanding of the situation at the front. Instead of ordering a general retreat and creating a second echelon defense line, Defense Commissar Timoshenko sent directives for a decisive counteroffensive and transferring combat operations to enemy territory. These senseless orders led to the encirclement and death of more and more Soviet groups. The German strategic concept was reduced to a simple formula: conquer and destroy. In July 1941, Hitler ordered the shooting of anyone who looked askance. Total liquidation was to be applied to Red Army commissars, party workers, and Jews. In his war diary, the chief of the General Staff of the Army, Franz Halder, called the war with Russia a death sentence for Bolshevism as an anti-social gathering of criminals. In strict accordance with the Barbarossa Plan, the Germans struck in 3 main directions: North, Central, and South. Army Group North, consisting of 23 infantry, 3 tank, and 3 motorized divisions under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, advanced through the Baltics, Novgorod, and Pskov towards Leningrad. Army Group Center, with 34 infantry, 9 tank, 6 motorized, 1 cavalry division, and 2 motorized brigades, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, advanced through Minsk and Smolensk towards Moscow. The South Group delivered the main blow towards Kiev. It included 7 German infantry divisions, over 27 Romanian divisions and brigades, and 4 Hungarian brigades. They were commanded by Field Marshal Karl von Rundstedt. On June 24th, 4 German and 2 Finnish divisions of the Norway Group began advancing on the Kola Peninsula. They aimed to seize the coast and the port city of Murmansk. The Barbarossa Plan was designed for another blitzkrieg. Military operations in winter conditions were not anticipated. Germany and its allies in the war, Romania, Italy, Hungary, Finland, and Slovakia, assumed that the fighting on the Eastern Front would end within 8 to 16 weeks. And in the first month of the war, it seemed that these calculations were coming true. Despite the heroic resistance of some Red Army units, they could not stop the enemy. On the very first day of the war, the leaders of the USA and England declared their unconditional support for Soviet Russia. On July 12, 1941, a Soviet-British agreement on joint actions in the war against Germany was signed in Moscow. These were extremely important steps, but for now, the USSR was fighting Germany one-on-one. On June 28th, the Germans captured Minsk, the capital of Belarus. The main forces of the Soviet Western Front, over 300,000 people, were cut off and destroyed. In the first 2.5 weeks of fighting, the Germans advanced 500 kilometers in the northwest, 700 kilometers in the west, and 400 kilometers in the south. There was a threat to Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev. Huge numbers of civilians were forced to flee eastward. 15 million people left the territories occupied by the invaders. Thousands of enterprises and institutions were evacuated to the Urals and Siberia. However, tens of millions could not escape and remained in the occupied zone. They faced the horrors of the fascist regime or forced labor in Germany. Many fled to the forests and formed partisan units, which would eventually be subordinated to centralized party leadership. But there were also those who collaborated with the Germans. About 400,000 collaborators served in the auxiliary forces of the Wehrmacht. Stalin was completely bewildered in the early days of the war. He completely withdrew from affairs, hiding at one of the dachas. His political allies, members of the groups led by Malenkov, Beria, and Andrei Zhdanov, did not dare to take on the burden of power in the critical situation. According to Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs, on June 29th, after a joint meeting, the country's and army's top leaders firmly demanded that Stalin return to lead the country. On June 30th, Stalin headed the newly created State Defense Committee. Then he became the People's Commissar of Defense. He appointed Semyon Timoshenko as the commander of the Western Fronts, Kliment Voroshilov of the Northwestern. And Semyon Budyonny of the Southwestern. Stalin believed that such commanders, seasoned by the Civil War, would quickly handle the desperate situation at the fronts. The next month showed that they did not meet these expectations. Stalin became the supreme commander, fully concentrating military and civilian control in his hands. Meanwhile, during these weeks, without waiting for orders, the people rose to fight the invaders. Tense music. Tens of thousands of volunteers joined the army. People went to the front to win or die. However, neither the desperate regimes of Soviet soldiers nor changes at the top could stop the enemy's advance. Even the appearance of the new powerful weapon, the famous Soviet Katyushas, could not change the situation. In July, the Red Army lost over 2 million people killed and wounded. About 1 million were captured. The German advantage was overwhelming. July. 10, after bringing in fresh forces, the Germans delivered a powerful blow in the Smolensk-Moscow direction. Fierce battles unfolded. The 63rd Infantry Corps successfully acted against the Germans, but eventually it was surrounded and defeated, losing its commander, General Leonid Petrovsky. On July 16th, the superior forces of the Wehrmacht occupied Smolensk. Yet the Soviet troops did not allow the Germans to develop their initial success. General Mikhail Lukin's 16th Army supported. By the 20th Army, for the first time, halted the German advance, launched a counterattack, and on July 27th broke into Smolensk. However, both armies were then surrounded and emerged with heavy losses. However, Group Center could not advance towards Moscow for 2 whole months. During this time, Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov replaced General Georgy Zhukov as chief of the General Staff. The Reserve Front under Georgy Zhukov and the Bryansk Front under General Andrei Yeryomenko were formed. In the stubborn and bloody battles near Yelnya, the troops of these fronts tried to defeat the 2nd Tank Group Guderian. They managed to liberate Yelnya because the main forces of Group Center were thrown into encircling the Soviet Southwestern Front. Sensing a threat to the flanks of Group Center, the German command changed its plans and sharply intensified actions in the north and south, in the Leningrad and Kiev directions. Simultaneously, with the 18th Army of the Wehrmacht striking in Estonia, the 16th Army and the 4th Tank Group began an offensive from the southwest towards Leningrad. $160,000 Leningrad militia members, 10 rifle divisions were mobilized. The hastily constructed Luga defensive line was easily breached by the Germans. On August 15th, they occupied Novgorod. And on the 20th, they cut the roads between Leningrad and Moscow. From the north, the Finnish army advanced on Leningrad. On September 8th, reaching Lake Ladoga, the Germans blockaded Leningrad. On this day, the first major air raid on the city was carried out. The Germans dropped over 6,000 bombs and destroyed large food warehouses that had not been timely secured in safe places. Franz Halder writes in his diary that the Führer made a firm decision to level Leningrad and Moscow to the ground, so that no one would have to be fed there in winter. But it wasn't just about that. Moscow and Leningrad were symbols of the revolution, so they were to be destroyed. Initially, Hitler expected Group North to finish with Leningrad by July 21st. Now, although delayed, the Germans were close to their goal. The threat looming over Leningrad forced Stalin to remove his inept favorite Voroshilov from the post of commander of the Leningrad front and appoint Zhukov in his place, who managed to improve the organization of the defense. Military ships, which had made the transition from Stalin to Kronstadt 2 weeks earlier, came to the aid of Leningrad's defenders. Many sailors joined the ground forces. Hitler's plans changed. Facing increasing resistance, he ordered part of the troops to return to the Moscow direction, leaving heavy artillery near Leningrad. The blockade of the city began, which would last 900 days. Every day, the situation worsened for the Soviet troops, and the situation in the south. Despite the Bryansk front's attempt to stop the German advance, Guderian's tanks broke through to the rear of the southwestern front's troops, creating a threat of encirclement. Realizing this, the commander of the southwestern direction, Semyon Budyonny, asked Stalin for permission to retreat from Kyiv. Stalin refused. Appointing Timoshenko in Budyonny's place, he ordered to stand to the death. Retreat was still necessary, but it was already too late. It all ended with the encirclement of 4 Soviet armies. 660,000 soldiers were captured. Kyiv fell on September 19th. After this catastrophe, the defense of Odessa, which heroically held out deep in the enemy's rear, lost its strategic significance. It was decided to transfer all forces from Odessa to the Sevastopol area. The decision was correct but delayed. Reinforcements from Odessa were just deploying, and the Germans had already broken through the Crimean isthmuses, which could have been made impregnable in 3 months of war if desired. The enemy approached Sevastopol closely. 8 months of unparalleled defense of the besieged city lay ahead. Securing the flanks of Group Center, the Germans began a decisive offensive on the Soviet capital. The Führer personally ordered the capture and flooding of Moscow. The operation was named Typhoon. The Wehrmacht concentrated a third more infantry, about twice as much artillery and aviation, and 1.5 times more tanks on the Moscow direction than the city's defenders had. The Red Army's military and diversionary intelligence failed to detect the location of the German troops preparing for the offensive. The command, with significant delay, sent directives to the Western and Bryansk fronts to create a line of firm and stubborn defense. The offensive that began on September 30th caught the Soviet troops in a strategically bad spot. The Germans easily broke through the lines, encircling 4 Soviet armies near 𝑉𝒂zh𝒔 and 2 near Bryansk. Only the heroic resistance of the encircled troops held back 28 Hitler divisions from a decisive push towards Moscow. At that moment, the Stavka had no strategic reserves to cover the Moscow direction. On October 7th, Georgy Zhukov was urgently recalled from Leningrad and took command of Moscow's defense. Two lines of defense are being constructed around the capital. Tense music. Leading the Corps' armies defending Moscow are generals who have proven their combat skills. Konstantin Arksovsky, Leonid Govorov, Ivan Zakharkin, Mikhail Kadykov, and others. German offensive continued. On October 14th, the city of Kalinin, north of Moscow, fell, and on October 18th, 𝑀𝒉𝒆, south of Moscow. The Germans had just over 100 kilometers to reach the capital, which was under threat of destruction. On October 16th, many Muscovites were hastily leaving the city. Some government institutions were evacuated. On October 19th, Moscow was declared under siege. However, the Germans could not take Moscow. The so-called Russian factor came into play. The fierce resistance of Soviet soldiers led to unprecedented German losses and broke their morale. In the first months of the war on the Eastern Front, about 500,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Half of the tanks that entered the war and 1,500 aircraft were left on the battlefields. In just a month of raids on Moscow, about 200 bombers were shot down. Forced to conduct combat operations on a vast 1,000-kilometer front, the Germans lacked reserves to strengthen the strike group aimed at Moscow at the crucial moment. They felt an acute shortage of fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The dreaded Russian winter was approaching. Hitler did not want to accept the idea of a blitzkrieg failure and a transition to a prolonged war. He used the 2-week respite to concentrate all possible forces and means for a decisive offensive on Moscow. Tense music. However, the Soviet command used this time much more effectively. Significant reserves were brought in, including elite Siberian divisions. The defense lines were strengthened. Stalin undertook an action to boost the morale of the army and the people. On November 6th, on the eve of the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution, he spoke at a ceremonial meeting in the hall of the 𝑻𝒉𝒆 metro station. This is now the task. We can and must accomplish this task. Our cause is just. Victory will be ours. And the next day, as in pre-war years, the traditional military parade took place on Red Square. These events instilled faith in ultimate victory among the Soviet people. The German offensive that began in mid-November indeed turned out to be decisive. Operation Typhoon ended in failure. Although the German vanguard could already see the outskirts of Moscow in the distance, they never broke through the defense. The defenders of Moscow fought steadfastly and bravely. At the Duboseko station, 28 tank destroyers from General Ivan Panfilov's division held off 50 German tanks attacking the flank of the 16th Army for 4 hours. Only 5 survived, but the tanks never got through. 3 days later, Panfilov's division was awarded the title of Guards. General Panfilov did not learn of this. He died in battle the day before. By early December, the German Central Group, deprived of reinforcements, was completely exhausted. The Soviet army now had an advantage in artillery and aviation near Moscow. More and more excellent T-34 tanks were arriving at the front. The personnel of the Red Army was about 1.5 times larger than that of the Germans. Factories evacuated to the Urals and Siberia quickly ramped up production. Mostly women and teenagers worked, working 10-15 hours a day, providing the army with weapons. A nationwide collection of personal donations for the front's needs was organized. The army received hundreds of additional aircraft, tanks, and other equipment. On December 6th, Soviet troops delivered several blows to the German flanks and then launched a broad counteroffensive. Hitler took command himself and ordered them to stand to the death in every trench. Despite this, the Germans sometimes retreated in panic. The personnel of the encircled Guderian tank group near Tula barely escaped, abandoning 3/4 of their equipment. The attackers' losses were significant, more than those of the enemy. By the end of January, the center group had retreated from Moscow by 200 to 400 kilometers. More than 11,000 settlements, mostly charred ruins, were liberated. Reports of the atrocities of the fascist occupiers sparked a new wave of hatred towards the invaders. The battle for Moscow became a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front and in the entire Second World War. The Allies' victory was still far off, but Hitler no longer had a chance to win. However, at that time, no one yet understood that the turning point had occurred. A vast part of the European territory of the USSR remained occupied. Leningrad was still under blockade. In the winter of 1941-42, the city was almost impossible to supply with food. Some supplies were delivered by trucks crossing Lake Ladoga on the icy route called the Road of Life. But many Leningraders' lives were not saved. The bread ration was 125 grams a day. Heating did not work. The water supply froze. Transport stopped. About 1 million Leningraders died from hunger and cold. The city was also subjected to constant shelling by long-range artillery. the failure near Moscow, Hitler continued to believe in Germany's victory. Stalin, having gained confidence in his strategic talent, stopped fearing defeat in the war. He sought to quickly finish off the enemy, who seemed exhausted and demoralized. Contrary to Zhukov's cautious objections, Stalin ordered offensive operations on all fronts, instead of organizing strategic defense. Very soon, it became clear that the exhausted Red Army was unable to fulfill this order. Attempts to advance stalled, bringing large and completely unnecessary losses. In March 1942, all fronts switched to defense. At the same time, in March, the Hitlerite headquarters began developing a strategic plan codenamed first Siegfried, then Blau, and finally Braunschweig. By this time, Germany, Italy, and Japan controlled most of the European continent, as well as part of North Africa and several countries. In Asia and the ocean, the Japanese neared India's borders. The German-Italian push on Egypt was advancing. Events on the Eastern Front stopped Hitler from boosting Rommel's forces in North Africa. Given the situation, the German command chose to strike mainly on the southern Eastern Front. Take over the North Caucasus, Crimea, and Transcaucasia. The Germans aimed to grab grain and oil areas and planned to break into Iran, cutting off Russia from Allied help coming from. The South then hit India and the Middle East. Around 1 million soldiers, 1,200 tanks, 1,600 planes, and over 17,000 guns and mortars were set for the operation. Soviet forces here were about equal in gear and greater in numbers. Thanks to German intelligence, a fake plan named Kremlin reached Stalin. Even though Soviet intelligence reported large German forces in the south, Stalin moved troops to the center, leaving the south open. Meanwhile, he agreed with Timoshenko and Khrushchev, a military council and Politburo member, to allow a local operation to take Kharkov. General Zhukov, Chief of Staff Marshal Shaposhnikov, and his deputy General Vasilevsky were firmly against it. Yet in May 1942, the Kharkov offensive began. In less than 2 weeks, the worst fears came true. The Germans threatened to encircle the advancing forces. But when the military asked to stop and pull back, Stalin said no. This led to the loss of the main forces of the Southwestern Front, 3 armies of 400,000 men. Screenwriters Yuri Geller, Alexander Eisenberg, consultants Nikolai Mitrofanov, Yulia Safonenko, Elena Kolikova, producers John Dukas, Matthew King Kaufman, Maxim Zolotakin, directors Alexander Eisenberg, Matthew King Kaufman. The film used materials from the Russian State Archive, film and photo documents, the TV and Radio Fund, the State Film Fund, the Central Museum of the Armed Forces, and private collections. Produced by Eastern Light, Close Up Castle Communications. The film was voiced by NTV.